Welcome to Let's Talk Death, conversations to inform and inspire. Let's Talk Death is a series of conversations with some amazing people from various fields. Our goal through these conversations is to normalize, educate, and demystify the taboo around death, dying, and the journey of grief. Hello, welcome to this episode of Let's Talk Death. I'm Fran Solomon.
And I'm Andy McNeil.
And we're thrilled to be your host for these conversations. Let's Talk Death is brought to you by Heal Grief, a social support network creating community after someone has died. Everything we do is inspired by our core belief that no one should ever grieve alone.
Our goal with this program is to have a friendly chat with some amazing people so we can help normalize and educate our Heal Grief community. Our guest today is Marni Blank. Marni is a trained death doula, mediator, lawyer, and female-founded small business owner. Marni's goal is to create a safe space to learn and talk about death, dying, and grief, including one's accountability in completing advanced care directives and end-of-life planning, creating legacy projects, and helping with pre- and post-death logistics. She brings deep compassion, active listening, practical resources, and a healthy dose of humor to her work. Death and grief affect us all, and Marni has learned the more we connect with our families, communities, and ourselves, the less fear plays into these critical discussions and decisions. She has written articles for Trust and Will and Lantern. Marni, we are delighted to have you as a guest on our show.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here today.
Marni, before we speak about your work, may I first take you back in time and ask you to share about your experience after your mother's accident that led you to the work you do now?
Sure. So I was going about my life having dinner with some friends, and I got the call that you don't want to get, saying, your mom's in the hospital, she's okay, but and she had been in a sort of a freak car accident. And the first things that went through my mind were not, is she okay? Obviously, I was worried about that, but it was, oh my gosh, I have all of her documents sitting on my desk, which I have not gotten signed, that were my responsibility to take care of, her advanced directives. And I am a lawyer by background. I'm very responsible and organized. And there was some sort of block for me around dealing with paperwork that had to do with my mother's death. And it really got me thinking about, if this was a problem for me, this was going to be a problem with a lot of people of my generation. I'm at an age where, my parents are getting older. And this is something that we have to be thinking about, not only for them, but for ourselves. And so, after I got all of those things taken care of and being at the hospital with my mother, I started to realize all of the logistics that went into, you know, not even just when someone dies, but when someone is critically injured, what to do with her pets, her mail, dealing with insurance, an accident report with the police. There are so many things, finding a rehab center for her. Luckily, I had my sister to help me with some of these things, but it felt really lonely. And I went onto the internet and, how do I deal with this? What do I do? And I really found a lack of resources that felt supportive to me. And so it really got me thinking about caregiving and about, when you are dealing with all of the logistics around either someone's passing or someone's serious illness, there's little time to be sitting in grief. You don't get to experience that grief. You shove it down and you deal with all the things that are right in front of you. But it doesn't mean that those things go away. It just means that they're sitting and waiting for another time to pop back up. And so it really, it changed the path that I was going on, and it made me go to a death doula training program and to really start to learn all about these things so that I could help be a resource for other people going through it.
It's fantastic. First of all, thank you for thinking about how you can, you've walked before someone and how you can turn around and help give a helping hand to someone coming after you. I mean, it's what in many ways, the entire bereavement support field is built on, is that sense of, hey, I've been there, and let me attempt to make it a little bit smoother process for you than it was for me. I've learned some things, and this is what that looks like. I know that quite often I will have people come to me who are newly bereaved, and maybe they're 6-7 months out, and they'll say, I think it's getting harder than it was even at the beginning. And when they start talking about what it was like at the beginning, they were running around dealing with so many logistics. It's a different part of your brain that handles that. It's like this cognitive shift that happens at some point where you all of a sudden now you are fully present with your grief. Whereas before you had so many things that no one told you were going to need to manage and deal with, even just the phone calls that you have to make on people's bills and all of the other pieces and parts. How many people want a death certificate so that you can prove out certain things? I mean, the list goes on, and it's difficult two ways. One, people who can make that kind of shift and focus on that, and they aren't experiencing their grief. But even more challenging are those who can't make the cognitive shift to do the logistics because they are so focused on their grief. So I think both happen in there. So I can see where this can be very, very supportive.
I agree. And there are other, there are some people who, are very logistics oriented and who can just get to it. And there are other people who it's overwhelming, and they're, where they can help out lays in other ways. And having someone who can also just point you in the right direction. You don't know what you don't know when you come into a situation like this, and so having someone who can say, okay, well, have you thought about this? Have you thought about this? And here's how I can help guide you. I feel is invaluable, and something that I didn't feel like I had access to when I was going through it.
Now, I want to put a twist on this whole conversation, and this is based on feedback that we've actually heard from our community members, that often when someone doesn't have their end-of-life wishes in place and family is left to make those decisions for them, it can create a divisive wedge between family members who believe their person would want something different. And then that in itself delays the healing process because there's so much turmoil and so much fighting. And then it's grief on top of grief. It's not only now grieving over someone who died and didn't write down their wishes or make their wishes known. It's now the fighting between siblings and family members on, that'll tear a family apart.
You're right. It can create a burden in many ways. It can create a burden of just adding an extra layer of what you need to be thinking about. It can create what you're saying, a divide between family members. And it also, the deceased don't have a say in, in how their wishes are played out. It's really the biggest gift to be able to have your advance directives in order if someone's at the hospital, for the people grieving to not have to make these large decisions in that moment where you're not necessarily making the right decisions or the best decisions because you're under this time pressure and you're under this stress. But to be able to leave very clear guidance for the people who are going to be caring for you or after wishes is a huge gift to family.
Yeah, I'd like to. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I have training in elder mediation, and having these conversations between family members in advance, being able to hear, the different sides. Maybe, siblings do have different understandings of what they think should be happening at the end of life or after someone passes, and having those conversations up front, while uncomfortable, can really be a healing moment for a family.
Yeah, in my house, I mean, we've kind of, by the work I do, we've kind of actually made it funny. I mean, my kids know that my favorite color is cobalt blue, and anybody coming to pay tribute has to have cobalt blue. And hopefully when they see cobalt blue, they're going to say, there's mom.
We also have that in our family. My dad is a huge Costco fan. And Costco, I don't know if you know, but they sell urns and caskets. And we have already said that we'll be burying him in a Costco urn. He's all for it, but we make it light, we make it part of the conversation. But we've had so many more conversations in the last few years about death and dying, and have made it just part of our regular conversation that it's less uncomfortable to talk about.
Yeah, we're
I think
Jewish,
that's
and
a big piece.
we're
Go
Jewish, and
ahead.
I just assume that we're going to have, a deli. And my husband, he said, no, I want Chinese food.
See, you never know. Assumptions can lead us down the wrong path all the time. I did want to go back on something that you mentioned earlier when you were sharing your story, because I think it is a piece to this, and that's the barriers to us doing this preparation. And you mentioned even for yourself, even being a lawyer and working in this, and knowing that these are things that we need to have in place. I would say even myself, 3 decades in bereavement support field, even knowing, for some reason, when it comes to our personal, like getting those final things in place, and you had mentioned it this way, for some reason, I wasn't able to do that something like that. I wasn't able to do that for myself. And I think, and you mentioned your generation, and I think somehow it's tied to our culture somehow, and where our focus might be. But I am curious your thoughts on, I know you've probably seen it as well, what some of those barriers are, and why. Like, why do we find ourselves in that situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we don't, as a culture, like you said, a lot of cultures have death as part of life. It is something that is, you know, really honored, especially, yeah, I mean, it's really honored. And I feel like in our culture, it's kept like in the dark, it's kept in the shadows. It's something that people don't really talk about or think about. And therefore it won't happen. And none of us are guaranteed a long life, but I think that the younger generation, it's easier to think, oh, well, I have plenty of time to be doing these documents. Like, I'm not there yet, I don't need to, or I know I should do that, but I have plenty of time for that. But no one is guaranteed that long life. And my generation, when going through major life events like buying a house, having a child, or even just experiencing, the death or loss of an elder. These are the moments where you're thinking about it more, that that you should do it. It's on that to-do list. But to actually go through the steps of doing it feels overwhelming, because it's not part of our culture. We don't know where to begin. And when we don't know where we begin, we just put it off for another day. And that's not the best. As we've talked about, putting it off means that you might not have your wishes known later. You might not have that say, and you might leave it to family members who are going to be dealing with their own grief at the time. So I do think that there is like a cultural block around it. I think that one of the things that the pandemic has brought up is this sense of grief overall in our culture. And that none of us are immune from experiencing loss and grief. And I do think that now that this has happened, it is a time that people have taken more stock in, where am I at? What could I be doing to plan? Because we know that things happen that we aren't necessarily planning. And this is one thing that we can control.
Marni, I want to take a shift. For those of us who do not know, what is a death doula?
A death doula is someone who can help educate and be a resource for families. Not only, the traditional death doula is someone who can sit bedside and, help care for a family, offer support at a time of someone's passing. But a death doula is much more than that. They can be someone who educates the community around death, dying, and grief. They can help you do your advanced directives and end of life planning. And really, they're a way in which you can have conversations with people who are not worried about, who can hold space in an uncomfortable conversation. And so they can come in any part of life. And really, it's a way in which to have someone who can help you think about, how can I live my best life now? It's really, when you think about death, it's not just death. It's like, how can I create the best life I can lead while I have it? And so that when I get to my deathbed, how do I want to feel? How do I want to be remembered? And death doulas are a resource for people to have those conversations. We can also do things like legacy work, whether that's creating audio or video of our elders and capturing stories and memories. It could be creating memory quilts. It could be recipe books. There are so many ways in which to honor people in our lives and honor ourselves in our journey. And so death doulas are sort of everywhere in the process of life and death.
So I was under the impression that death doulas come in really at a time of death, but what I'm hearing is that perhaps it's even earlier than that to do the planning.
Yes. There are certain death doulas who focus on those end stages where they can come in sort of when hospice comes in, sort of the late stages, and be there to hold vigil, to help with home funerals, to help guide the family in next steps. But really, when you get to that point, you've potentially missed an opportunity to have some of these difficult conversations or have someone help facilitate the conversations when you're young and healthy. And my goal is really to be focused on the younger generation, the 30s through mid 50s as well, to have these conversations earlier. So you're not getting to the end of life and feeling scared or worried or don't know what's going to happen. The more information we have, the more educated we are, the more empowered we feel, and the more light we can feel just in our day-to-day lives, to not have this thing that's in the shadows waiting for us that we don't understand, but to have those conversations earlier. Excuse my dogs, we're fighting in the background.
Yeah. It's all good. It's all good. You wouldn't have even known it. You wouldn't even known. Well, we actually have reached the end of our time together. Before we end our conversation, though, we do have people who chime into the show that always like to know how they can connect with our guests. How might people connect with you or your work?
Sure. So my website is marniblank.com, marniblank.com. I apologize. marniblank.com. And then my Instagram handle, hold on one second.
My dog just came in too.
She just wanted to be on camera.
There you go.
I apologize. And then my Instagram handle is at beginwith_theend.com. And those are the main places that you could find me.
Great.
Marni, we want to thank you so much for being a guest here on Let's Talk Death and for sharing the story behind your work.
Thank you so much for having me.
And we also want to thank those who are joining us for this episode of Let's Talk Death. If you would like to learn more about Heal Grief, please visit us at healgrief.org. At healgrief.org, you can learn more about all of the programs and resources of Heal Grief, including our national network of support for grieving young adults called Actively Moving Forward.
And if you know of a bereaved adult, refer them to the AMF app, where adults of all ages connect with others experiencing a similar death loss. And last, make sure to sign up at healgrief.org to receive our newsletter for links to future episodes of Let's Talk Death.
And so with that, again, we thank you for joining us, and we will see you next time on Let's Talk Death.